Hi there, Steve Kaufman here to talk about language learning, and in particular to talk about how we can get better at the nuts and bolts, the structures of a language, speak better. And I'm going to follow this. This is essentially an introduction to me using LingQ and showing you how I focus in on phrases, save phrases, tag phrases, and how I do that. But essentially, in language learning, in my experience, which is now 50 years or more of conscious language learning, the bulk of my time has been listening and reading. Except in those situations where I was in an environment where the language was spoken, like Japan or France. And however, you do have to spend some time on the structures. And the less you are in the country, the more you have to do this, in my view, this sort of deliberate trying to focus in on certain things that you may not notice or improving your ability to notice. So I refer, sometimes this is maybe an 80-20 situation. 80% of the time is sort of big picture learning, top-down learning, listening and reading, enjoying things in the language. But 20% has to be focusing in on some of the frequently used expressions, grammatical structures, pronunciation, and so forth, more deliberate learning. That percentage is much smaller if you live where the language is used, because then you're using it all the time and you're noticing more. You will see that I will discuss in the video you're about to see two things really. One is these mini stories, which I have referred to before, where we try to use the most common verbs in the language, where in each story the vocabulary repeats 3 times, 4 times. So they're great for listening to, especially while doing other tasks, because they are kind of interesting little stories, but mostly you're listening for these structures, these grammatical forms that maybe you missed the first time and then you get it the second time or the third time, because the basic vocabulary repeats so often that you know what the vocabulary is. You're starting to focus in on the structures. You're starting to focus in on the nuts and bolts. And if on top of that you can, using LingQ for example, or in some other way, focus in on phrases, save phrases, review the phrases, identify what kind of grammatical sort of function this phrase represents. All of this helps you notice. And helping you notice is dealing with that 20%, making you more alert to the language, so that when you're in the major activity, which is your, enjoyable and interesting listening and reading, you're picking up on things. Because if you don't notice things, you can't learn those things. So developing a greater awareness of the language is very important. I think the mini stories are a great way to do this. And if within the mini stories you save and tag phrases, that even heightens your awareness more. I'm going to get back to these mini stories. We have 60 already written. They're being translated. Maybe people out there want to help us write more stories in the same format. We'd be happy to have more volunteers. Now I will let you have a look over my shoulder, so to speak, as I use LingQ to save phrases, tag phrases, and how I do that. So here you are at my workspace, my lesson page at LingQ. I have to tell you that I normally do this on my iPad using the iLingQ app, but I don't know how to get a screen capture of that. I'm using Movavi software, which once I figured it out looks pretty good. So I'm going to start here with Russian, and then I will flip to a few other languages, because with Russian I have a very large vocabulary. It says here that I have 92,000 known words. Of course, in Slavic languages there are many forms of each word, so I don't want to put too much importance on this number, but it means that I know a lot of words. So if I read literature or newspaper articles, basically I know most of the words. However, I still struggle with the structure, especially when I'm speaking. And so we need to spend time on the nuts and bolts, which is the grammar, the structure, the use of the most common words, give and take, go and come, And that's where the mini stories come in. The mini stories here, and I'm going to open this, happen to be at number 17. We have 60 mini stories. They're not all available in all languages. The first level, which is 1 to 20, only has the present tense. All the stories have a high focus on the most common verbs of the language. The mini stories consist of 3 parts, 2 different sort of points of view, plus questions so that the vocabulary repeats. They're great for listening to over and over again to work on the basics. And you can do this at any level. You can do it when you're starting out to learn the language, or you can go back in, as I'm doing, as a means of trying to nail down some of the aspects of grammar which give me trouble. So let's open up this story here. Now, in addition to listening to these mini stories, which I think are ideal for this purpose, you heard the text-to-speech there, by the way. I have turned on my automatic text-to-speech. One thing that I find useful is to go in and then save phrases. So here, for example,
Возвращается.
I can look at the individual verb here, возвращается, go home, or by
Возвращается домой.
I get the phrase, возвращается домой. The phrase is whatever I have saved. I could have included mark here, but I chose not to. I want, as much as possible, short phrases that I think could repeat elsewhere. So I start to get these phrases in different texts that I'm studying. Now, I have tagged this phrase, first of all, as direction, because I'm going home. And in Slavic languages, going to and from something is sometimes in the accusative case, sometimes in the genitive case. I apologize to those of you who don't know what cases are, but cases in Slavic languages and in German and other languages are different forms of nouns that change depending on the function of the noun in the sentence. And so I've tagged it for direction. I also tag it for motion because in Slavic languages, verbs of motion are sometimes difficult for a non-native speaker to get a hang of. So I now am creating a bunch of phrases that will either be tagged as direction or tagged as motion, so that when I review in vocabulary, which I'll show you shortly, I can see a bunch of these phrases concentrated. And I'll get into that in greater detail. If I move along
Работы.
here, работы is a form, again, it's the genitive case of работа, which is work. Why is it in the genitive?
С работы.
Click again. Because it's from, like the from meaning with с работы is in the genitive. So I've also tagged this as direction. All right. If we go on here, for example,
Домой.
домой is home, but I click a
Он
second.
каждый день едет домой за рулем своей машины.
So this time I've saved the whole sentence. You can save whatever you want as a phrase. So now if I were doing it again, I might do it in a different order, but он каждый день едет домой. Едет домой is a verb of motion, so I tagged it as motion. За рулем is instrumental. He's using the steering wheel of his car, so to speak. But it's an expression that means he's at the wheel of his car. And своей машины is genitive. So again, just to show you that I can then go into the vocab section and find all of the phrases that I tagged for whatever I tagged. Now, with Russian, I'm not doing as much other than this focus on the mini stories because we just started creating them and they're a great place for me to work on my grammar. I have been much more active in, for example, Ukrainian. So let's open up Ukrainian. So here we see that recently I've read, this was an article from Radio Svoboda where they also had the audio. This is my conversation report from my tutor. This is an article that's basically appears automatically from Vysoky Zamok, which is a newspaper in Lviv, and so forth. But here, if I go to my vocabulary list, you'll see that I have 32,000 links that I've created, words and phrases. If I just go to phrases, I see that I have 4,540 phrases, which is still a lot to review. So I tend to want to filter these, okay? Now, I can sort them alphabetically by when I created these links. For example, I want to see the most recent ones. And I can look at, for example, what did I save in the accusative, for example. So here I have my list of phrases that I have saved. Now, it's possible that in some of these, for example, okay, here's an example of something I've saved. Na moment annexi Krimu, at the time of the annexation of Crimea. It's na moment is accusative, but it's also an expression of time, at the moment or at the time of. Annexi Krimu are both genitive. So I've saved this. Now, one thing I can do is to, oh, by the way, if I'm not sure that I have all of these are in fact the accusative, and I've tried to look them up beforehand to make sure, but I can send these to, I can simply export them and send them as a file to my tutor and say, please check that I have tagged these correctly. And she might come back and say, no, these are not correct. The other thing I can do, and which I do, is record these so that I have the English followed by the Ukrainian. So it's a practice in pronunciation, one by one, Odin na Odin, then I say, trust Alexander Lukashenko, Doveriate Alexandru Lukashenko. At the time of the annexation of Crimea, na moment annexi Krimu. And so I have to listen to the English, I've got to think of it, and then I hear it in my pronunciation. And I can do it again a month later, and maybe my pronunciation improves. But it also gives me the opportunity to be reviewing these phrases away from the computer, while in the car, while doing dishes, and so forth. So another language that I have been sort of busy with is Greek. So we can quickly flip over to Greek. And here, with my mini stories, I'm up to 42 in the mini stories, and where I've saved a bunch of phrases. So again, I can have a look, and it works very much the same way. I have all these, I have 10,000 saved links, but in terms of phrases, I have 2,600. And if I look at filters, let's again go to accusative. And so then, agorase tingata, agorazo tingata, agorazo ton ipologisti. So if they're all, in alphabetical order, that can be helpful. Or if you prefer, you can look at them by creation date. So, sta alatis katikidia. So there, I can look at them scrambled alphabetically. However I want to do them, okay? Now, let us go to a language that might be more familiar to many of you. Let's go to French. All right, so here in French, again, we have the mini stories. So I can go in here and start saving some phrases. So, André a une nouvelle petite amie. Now, not everyone knows that petite amie means girlfriend.
Petite amie.
So it's worth saving that. So you can save that.
Petite amie.
Maybe you don't tag that. You just save that as a phrase. Okay, sa petite amie s'appelle
Sa
Sarah.
petite amie s'appelle Sarah.
Again, it's a
Sa
phrase.
petite amie s'appelle Sarah.
Now, one of the things that you might want to save is sa petite
Sa
amie.
petite amie.
And you might want to
Sa
go in
petite
there
amie.
and save it as adjective. Because in French, the agreement of the adjective is so important. So, sa petite amie is probably worth saving. Okay, il va faire les courses. Now, again, that's an
Il va
expression.
faire les courses.
He goes shopping. That's an expression.
Il va faire les courses.
You might want to tag, depends what you're interested in. You might want to tag that for, words that relate to buying things. There's lots of words that relate to buying, whatever you want. Let me just see if there's some
Côté.
grammatical. Again, there's a lot of phrases. Passer à côté,
Il passe à côté.
passe à côté.
Il passe à côté.
You might want to go motion, because the funny thing is that in all these languages there are sort of somewhat similar issues. If we're looking at motion, again, il quitte le magasin.
Il quitte le magasin.
He leaves the
Il
store.
quitte le
That's
magasin.
motion issue. Now bear in mind, at this level, all the verbs are in the present. Il rentre chez lui.
André rentre chez lui. Henri
Again,
rentre chez
it's a
lui.
very common, chez lui, it's a French form. Now, what I find is if I tag that for motion again, I'm often able to review more than one thing in the phrase. So I'm not only capturing the verb of motion, rentrer, like go home, but also chez lui, which is a very common expression. So that just gives you a bit of a sense in different languages of how useful the mini stories are, because as you see here, it was il passe à côté, il whatever, il a une nouvelle petite amie, and here j'ai une nouvelle petite amie, elle s'appelle Sarah, je veux cuisiner. So you might want to again save this.
Elle s'appelle Sarah.
Now, sometimes the
Elle
translation
s'appelle
is
Sarah.
wrong, and so it's she. Her name is Sarah, so you can actually change this. Her name is Sarah. Okay, and voila.
Je dis.
Voila, so it's all je, and then we have the
Petite
question.
amie.
So, veut-il cuisiner un déjeuner pour Sarah? So, again, you may not be comfortable. Veut-il cuisiner?
André veut y cuisiner. André veut y cuisiner.
Veut-il, the text to speech is a little messed up there. And you might put question. Maybe you are not comfortable with the way they form questions in French. Okay? So, but it's really something that you design for yourself, how best to use these tags and then to review them in the vocabulary list. So I think that's enough right now. I won't go to the vocabulary page in French, take you back to the main lesson page. I will go into, if people are interested, I can go into more detail in another video about how we import lessons, how we select content to learn from, and so forth. So that's it. I hope that was useful. Bye for now.